You're listening to Talking to Teens, where we speak with leading experts from a variety of disciplines about the art and science of parenting teenagers. I'm your host, Andy Earle. We're here today with Barbara Natterson-Horowitz and Kathryn Bowers, the authors of the new book, Wildhood, The Astounding Connections Between Human and Animal Adolescence. They're also the New York Times best-selling authors of Zoobiquity. Barbara and Kathryn have spent years studying the links between human adolescence and adolescence in animals, and they've found some surprising connections. Barbara is a professor both at Harvard and at UCLA, and she is an evolutionary biologist. Kathryn is an animal behaviorist and a writer who has taught at UCLA and Harvard as well. After teaming up to write the best-selling book Zoobiquity, Barbara and Kathryn couldn't help but notice the parallels between adolescence in animals and adolescence in humans. They started researching the subject and they ended up creating a course for college students on the topic, and the final result is this new book, Wildhood. Really excited to speak with Barbara and Kathryn today about the 4 high-stakes tests that they have found shape the destiny of every adolescent on Earth. How to be safe, how to socialize, how to connect romantically, and how to live independently. Barbara and Kathryn, thank you so much for coming on the show today. A good place usually to kind of jump in is sort of what led you to team up and to choose this topic and to spend this immense amount of time writing this book.
Yeah, well, this is Barbara, and Kathryn and I have been working together for over 10 years to explore what we can learn about human health and development from the natural world, and particularly from other species, from animals, and especially from wild animals. So I'm a cardiologist and a psychiatrist, and Kathryn is an animal behaviorist. And our first book was called Zoobiquity, and we looked at across the animal kingdom at cancer and heart disease and eating disorders and anxiety. And we learned a lot. And during that period of time, we also happened to be both raising adolescents, or they were coming into adolescence. And so we ended up turning the lens that we developed to study all these medical problems and psychiatric problems. We turned it to teenage life. And that's how Wildhood was born.
This is Kathryn, and yeah. What happened was we had been working on these for 10 years and found ourselves with adolescent animals of our own, in each of our separate households, and
Raising a herd of
we just couldn't help but apply our knowledge to what we saw out in the field. We were up in Northern California by the coast of Monterey, and we were looking out into the ocean, and we were with a biologist who was telling us about the area, which is full of great white sharks, and the sea mammals that live there have learned not to go into this area that has all these sharks. And he said, oh, except for there is one that will go in there. And we said, what is that animal? And he said, well, the adolescent otters. And Barbara and I looked at each other and we said, adolescent otters that are taking risks that their elders and their youngers don't take? This we have to look more closely at.
It's amazing how many parallels there are and how much can inform our views on human adolescence. And in the book, it's really done in a cool way. You guys follow kind of 4 stories of different animals that are kind of, coming of age or going through adolescence in their own ways. And then we learn different lessons about kind of these 4 universal journeys or kind of missions that are sort of fundamental to adolescence throughout the planet.
Yeah. It's a book about about human life. I mean, it's trying to understand, adolescence, in our species, but we were turning to other animals, and there's a lot of, deep scientific research, but we also wanted to tell stories that were based on reality. So what we did is we found studies that had actually looked at adolescent animals and their journeys using radio collar tracking and GPS. And we were able to find these 4 stories. One that illustrates the first of 4 competencies that you have to be a mature adult. So it turns out, whether you're a penguin, whether you're a hyena, whether you're a humpback whale, or whether you're a wolf, if you want to be a mature adult, you have got to, number 1, learn to be safe. That is, you need to protect yourself from predators. Number 2, you need to learn about status, which means social hierarchies and social systems and figuring out how to make friends and avoid enemies and all that.
Okay, that sounds familiar.
Number 3, you've got to learn about, really, it's about sexual communication. So it's not just about how to have sex, because it turns out if you put animals together, sex itself, that part of it, the mechanics are relatively easy. It's the courtship, the communication, it's the understanding, the expressing, the winning over. All that takes a long time and a lot of practice. So number 3 is sex. And then the 4th competency that we illustrated with these stories was learning to be self-reliant, literally finding your own food, feeding yourself, so that you don't go out in the world and starve to death, literally, if you're one of these wild animals. But, figuratively, if you go in the world and you're not prepared to make a living, it's a problem. So it was safety, status, sex, and self-reliance. And each of the animals in the book tells the story of one of those competencies.
Can you talk about what it means to be predator naive versus predator aware?
Yeah, so that's a term that that wildlife biologists use for adolescent animals who haven't had enough exposure to danger, and they do really dumb things. They and they do dumb things, and they sometimes suffer the consequences, and I mean, capital C consequences. So predator naivete is anything from not recognizing a predator who's hiding, who's camouflaged, to going into an area that older, more experienced animals know is way too dangerous. You just don't go there, like the triangle of death that Kathryn was talking about. But the flip side about predator naivete is that it drives a behavior called predator inspection. And it turns out predator inspection is what takes you from being naive to aware and safe. And so what we found is that across, we're talking about from bats to gazelle to lots and lots of adolescent animals will move toward and not away from predators. And they will. It seems insane. We have video of a bunch of species doing this. They do it together, the way a bunch of teens will do something when they're together that they might not do on their own. We have a video of a group of meerkats, adolescents, going toward a cobra and smelling it and looking at it. And it's insane. But it turns out these studies that have looked at predator inspection shows that if a predator naive adolescent doesn't get some experience with danger, they're never going to be safe.
And it's so interesting because these near misses that cause them to be safe, even though they're scary, as Barbara was saying, really do, provided they survive them, keep them safer later in life. But they sometimes have those near miss experiences by themselves, but the learning experience is heightened and even better if they're with a peer or a peer group. And so, sometimes we hear that human teens take more risks when they're with their friends. Yeah. They drive faster. Other animals do that too, and that leads us to hypothesize that this kind of behavior actually has the safety flip side, that it gives them the experience, the exposure that they need to be safer as adults. We have lots of studies about this in the book, and one of them found that not only being with peers and watching peers make mistakes can make an animal safer, but also hanging around more experienced peers and having them sort of mentor the younger animal in what's safe and what isn't safe, that can also help.
Okay, I hear that, but isn't getting together with friends and doing risky things what we don't want teenagers to do? Or is that, as long as they survive it within reason, it's good? Or how do we draw the line or know when it's bad?
Yeah, that's exactly the question, obviously. And what's interesting about this research is that we found these really paradoxical things that we thought were at first really head scratchers. And then the longer we sat with it and thought about it, the more we realized, well, wait a minute, maybe this is just decodes everything. So yes, there's no question that we know that peers can get human teenagers into a huge amount of trouble. I mean, the fact that kids are not allowed to drive with their friends in the car for the first, I don't know, like 6 months or whatever it is, I mean, that's directly related to the statistics that, it's not safe. Now, why would that be? Well, it turns out when kids get together, their risk taking, the threshold to take a risk is lower. And that's based on this brain biology, right? But then what is the evolution of this brain biology? Why is it that way? And one of the theories that we have is that predator inspection, actually this really important learning about your predator behavior, is made safer when you do it with others. And so it would make sense that there would be this biology of risk-taking with peers. Now, so there's this paradox that gaining exposure to danger is necessary to become safe. But on the other hand, when you're exposed to danger, you're exposing yourself to risk. So that's true whether you're a meerkat, and it's true whether you're a human. So what is a parent supposed to do? What is a teenager who's supposed to do? One of the things that we learned is that, there's no like universal every species playbook, but as a general principle, avoiding danger like completely is a really bad move from a safety perspective. And that may seem paradoxical, but it's not. And that one of the things we learn about animals is that they gain exposure to danger in a safe way by, there is safety in numbers. They do observe parents, they do observe peers, but that being isolated is actually one of the most dangerous things that happens. If you're an isolated adolescent fish or bird or mammal, you won't really learn ever to be safe.
It's also interesting to think about what the modern human version of a predator is.
Yeah.
Since we don't have, eagles dropping from the sky to carry us off, or
Right.
most of the time there aren't sort of lions waiting to jump us from behind. So if you think about the things that are dangerous and that can kill human beings, we have diseases, and we have wars and shootings and murderers and those kinds of scary dangers. And when you look at horror films and games that people play and books that people read and TV shows, a lot of the times the ones that appeal to teens do have to do with what we think is sort of like a human literary predator inspection, of allowing the reader in the safety of her own bedroom or the privacy of their internet connection to get up close to the things that are scary and dangerous and that could kill them, investigate them a little bit, learn about them without actually exposing themselves to the risk. So there's something there, I think, for teens to take away.
Yeah, so just not necessarily a bad thing to be spending a lot of time on Netflix watching things that have teenagers in them and show situations that they could get involved in.
Well, that was one of our head scratching moments that Barbara and I had, was, why are teens sort of the audience for horror and roller coasters and scary things like that, and adults seem to have quote unquote outgrown them. But that could be that just that the brain biology and the sort of socializing of an adolescent is more open to those scary things of inspecting the danger.
Mentally rehearsing kind of like survival situations. Then
yeah, that's nicely put. Mentally rehearsing.
You talk about kind of salmon in a study who are either exposed to predators or not, and they kind of look at the strategies that they adopt in order to then get away from predators when they're reintroduced. And there's like a few different strategies that they use, and I was wondering if you think there are, parallels between those salmon strategies and anything, that in human adolescence?
Well, I mean, yeah, that study, I mean, it's there's, you go to a restaurant, you order wild or farmed salmon, and you're trying to kind of like, okay, which am I supposed to order? Like, what's the upside and downside?
Why is one twice as expensive as the other one?
Exactly.
Is it worth it?
It's more experienced salmon.
Yeah, I mean, this is, we don't have the answer to that question, but it turns out there's a big difference between being a farmed salmon, where you're protected and really raised in a kind of in a pen where there are no predators, and being a wild, young salmon growing up. By the time they're adolescents, by the time they're smolts, and by the way, there are all these cool terms for adolescent animals. We say that all animals in adolescence are in their wildhood, which is the name of the book, but there are like smolts are adolescent salmon, and there's this great word for an adolescent eel called an elver. But in any event, when a wild salmon becomes an adolescent, they know the moves. They're ocean smart. They're sea smart, let's say. And the ones that are farmed aren't. They have to go into the sea for a period of time to, they're going to get larger and larger. And the ones that are farmed, there was one study that there was like a 95% predation rate, because they were so naive. In fact, their predators would wait by the outlet for them to be released, because they were just, it was just completely, ridiculous. So that these
frenzy.
Exactly. But the lessons that you learn from that, from the farm salmon versus the wild, is that, again, experience is really important, and overprotection is just not the right way to be safe. It's a short-term gain for a long-term, big loss.
There's an interesting lesson learned about peer behavior too from that study, which is that salmon, you've seen them schooling, and fish schooling is a protective behavior because they, there's safety in numbers, and they look bigger to a predator, and they're, harder to catch. But salmon have born with the instinct to school, but they need to literally practice with other fish so that their bodies line up and they move their bodies closer together and swim in the same direction. And if you raise a fish in a tank by itself, it never learns how to school. It's like trying to clap with one hand. It needs the other fish around it in order to learn those physical skills.
Some of the things that need to be learned during adolescence are gestures and sounds that indicate status and how to, navigate their place within the group. So what were the kind of lessons on that you guys saw from other species?
Yeah, it was interesting to think about anxiety, which is a really big issue with teenagers today. And, there's, do other animals have anxiety? And the answer is yes. I feel pretty confident in saying that. And it's not anthropomorphizing. It's based on brain biology. So what is human anxiety? What does it mean? So there's fear, right? Where the brain, is having an experience which is signaling, hey, you know what? There's something really dangerous going on. Change what you're doing. And animals experience fear when there's a predator nearby. Anxiety is a different neurobiology, which has to do with being in a social group and what's going on with your status. Now, status is kind of think of it as a not such a nice word. It's like, cars and clothes, and it's not, but it actually is the word that's used in animal behavior, and it has to do with being a social animal living in a hierarchy, and all social animals do, including us. When our status goes up, our brain chemistry changes. When our status goes down, it changes in a different way, but it changes. And the same thing is true, we found in our research in fish and birds and other mammals. So what does all that mean? It means that you can look at the brain biology of a fish and the brain biology of a human. And if a fish loses status, their serotonin systems are altered, their behavior is altered. And the same thing happens with humans. And what we mean by losing status as a teenager is anything from not being invited to a party, being humiliated online, bombing a series of tests, a test that you cared about. It can be a lot of different things. And, if you ask someone, what does that feel like? A kid's going to say, it feels awful. It feels horrible. That those words, it feels awful, feels horrible, those are human words used to describe a universal experience of losing status across vertebrate species, fish and birds and other mammals. So what we found is that status, it really affects mood. I have to say that when my kids were adolescents, or they're in their early 20s now, they'd be bummed out about things here and there, but it was before we'd written this book, and I didn't really think about status per se. I didn't really think to ask them about, what, I just wasn't part of what I was saying, how do you feel? Not things like, well, what's going on with popularity and that sort of stuff. But we found that actually status is so important for survival in animal groups. Animals who have higher status, they have more food, they have more protection, they have more opportunities to mate with others. So falling in status is the opposite. So that's really, we think, the evolutionary reason that it feels so good to rise in status and so awful to fall in status.
It also gives some insight into social media and why social media can be so powerfully exciting, but also can make you feel so bad if you're on it for too long. I mean, not only are you sort of getting the feel good and then feel bad brain biology hits from your actual social group, but you're also many social media platforms are false. They're way bigger than you would normally have. There are people you don't even know on there. There's celebrities who are professional risers in the social status, and you're kind of always put down if you're comparing yourself to a celebrity. So connecting these social hierarchical systems in animals to our feelings and moods in humans, we feel was a really powerful part of our book.
We are here with Barbara Natterson-Horowitz and Kathryn Bowers talking about their book Wildhood, and we're not done yet. Here's a look at what's coming up in the second half of the show.
And so what you see as normal across the animal kingdom is there isn't one way of doing it. It really varies depending on what's going on, what the resources are, but really paying attention to the environment and not having some fixed and rigid way of responding.
It's a little bit easier to talk about these issues when you're talking about them in a penguin or a hyena and not in yourself.
Sometimes teenagers, when they lose popularity, if they're humiliated, whatever it is, they really feel like it's a matter of life and death. And, as a parent, I remember literally saying, like, oh, come on, this is not a matter of life or death. But what I now understand is that actually, from an evolutionary perspective, the brain that teenagers are walking around with, losing status actually is a matter of life and death. And they have that retained biology. And so it actually, I think, can make parents more sympathetic for why their kids feel so awful when things happen like that.
It can also be hard for teenagers because societally, they often fall at the sort of lower end of the hierarchy anyway, just because they're younger and have less experience, and adults have had longer to gather up all the power and the resources. And then also, we suggest in the book the idea of creating status sanctuaries for teens to just get a break from the assessment. I mean, these don't have to be like, spa-like places of quiet contemplation. They're just really a moment in the day, a place, a group of people where you are not being socially judged, where you just get a break from trying to figure out if you're high or low or where you are. You can just be.
Want to hear the full interview? Sign up for a subscription today. You get unlimited access to all the interviews I've conducted. It's completely affordable, and your subscription helps support the work we do here at Talking to Teens. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.